Welcome students. So today I'm going to give you the video lecture of a course which is a project management. So in this video lecture we are going to discuss the topic of module 3. Basically in the module 3 we have to study about the financial analysis as well as socio-economic analysis of the project. So we will start with the financial analysis. So the first topic in the financial analysis is financial projection. So conceptually, the cost of the projects represent the total of all the items of outlay associated with a project which are supported by long-term funds. It is a sum of outlays on the following: land and site development, buildings and civil works, plant and machinery, technical know-how and engineering fees, expenses on foreign technicians and training of Indian technicians abroad, miscellaneous fixed assets, preliminary and capital issue expense, pre-operative expenses, margin money for working capital, and last, the initial cash losses. So we are going to discuss the following outlay which is associated with the finance of the project. The first is the land and site development. The cost of land and site development is the sum of the following: basic cost of land including conveyance and other allied charges, premium payable on leasehold and conveyance charges, cost of leveling and development, cost of laying approach roads and internal roads, cost of gates, cost of tube wells, and so on. The cost of land varies considerably from one location to another. While it is very high in the urban and even semi-urban location, it is relatively low in rural locations. The expenditure on site development too varies widely depending on the location and topography of the land. The next is building and civil work. The building and civil works cover the following: buildings for the main plant and equipment, buildings for auxiliary services like steam supply, workshops, laboratory, water supply, etc., godowns, warehouses, and open yard facilities, non-factory buildings like canteen, guest houses, time office, exercise houses, etc., quarter for the essential staff, silos, tanks, wells, chests, basins, cisterns, hoppers, bins, and other structures necessary for installation of the plant and equipment, garage sewers, drainage, etc., other civil engineering works. The cost of the building and civil works depend on the kinds of structures required, which in turn are dictated largely by the requirements of the manufacturing process. Once the kinds of structures required are specified, cost estimates are based on the plinth area and the rates for various types of structures. These rates, of course, vary with the location to some extent. We have to note that the cost of land varies considerably from one location to another. While it is very high in urban and semi-urban locations, it is relatively low in rural locations. Next is the plant and machinery. The cost of the plant and machinery, typically the most significant component of the project cost, which consists of the following. The first is the cost of imported machinery, and the second is the cost of indigenous machinery. If we talk about the cost of imported machinery, this is the sum of free on board value, shipping freight and insurance cost, import duty, and clearing, loading, unloading, and transportation charges. Other is the cost of indigenous machinery. It consists of free on rail cost, sales tax, octroi and other taxes if any, and railway freight and transport charges to the site. The next item of outlay is cost of stores and spares. So it covers the following things: foundation and installation charges, technical know-how and engineering fees, expenses on foreign technicians and trainings of Indian technicians abroad, and lastly, miscellaneous fixed assets. Now we will discuss each point individually. First, we will talk about the foundation and installation charges. The cost of the plant and machinery is based on the latest available quotation adjusted for the possible escalation. Generally, the provision for escalation is equal to the following product. Latest rate of annual inflation applicable to the plant and machinery multiply into length of the delivery period. The second is technical know-how and engineering fees. Often it is necessary to engage the technical consultants or collaborators from India or abroad for advice and help in various technical matters like preparation of the project report, choice of technology, selection of the plant and machinery, detailed engineering, and so on. While the amount payable for obtaining the technical know-how and engineering services for setting up the project is a component of the project cost. The royalty payable annually, which is typically a percentage of sales, is an operating expense which is taken into account in the preparation of the projected profitability statements. The third is expenses on foreign technicians and training of Indian technicians abroad. Basically, the services of foreign technician may be required in India for setting up the project and supervising the trial runs. Expenses on the travel, boarding, and lodging, along with their salaries and allowances, must be shown here. Likewise, expenses on Indian technicians who require training abroad must also be included here. And the last is the miscellaneous fixed assets. See, fixed assets and machinery, which are not a part of the direct manufacturing process, may be referred to as miscellaneous fixed assets. They include items like furniture, office, machinery and equipment, tools, vehicles, railway siding, diesel generating sets, transformers, boilers, piping systems, laboratory equipment, workshop equipment, effluent treatment plants, and so on. Expenses incurred for the procurement or use of patents, licenses, trademarks, copyright, etc., and deposits made with the electricity board may also be included here. These are some other aspects of the financial projection. The first is the preliminary and capital issue expense. So, expenses incurred for identifying the project, conducting the market survey, preparing the feasibility report, drafting the memorandum and article of association, and incorporating the company are referred to as preliminary expenses. Expenses borne in connection with the raising of capital from the public are also referred as capital issue expense. The major components of capital issue expenses are underwriting commission, brokerage, fees to managers and registrars, printing and postage expenses, advertising and publicity expenses, listing fee, and stamp duty. And second is the pre-operative expenses. So expenses of the following types incurred till the commencement of commercial production are referred to as pre-operative expenses. This includes establishment expenses, rent, rates and taxes, traveling expenses, interest and commitment charges on borrowings, insurance charges, mortgage expenses, interest on deferred payments, startup expenses, and miscellaneous expenses. There are some important notes related with the pre-operating expenses. The pre-operating expenses are directly related to the project implementation schedule. So delays in project implementation, which are fairly common, tend to push up these expenses. Appreciative of this, financial institutions allow for some delay, for example, 20 to 25% in the project implementation schedule, and accordingly permit a cushion in the estimate for pre-operative expenses. Pre-operative expenses incurred up to the point of time the plant and machinery are set up may be capitalized by apportioning them to fixed assets on some acceptable basis. The pre-operative expenses incurred from the point of time the plant and machinery are set up are treated as revenue expenditure. The firm may, however, treat them as deferred revenue expenditure and write them off over a period of time. Provision for contingencies. A provision for contingencies is made to provide for certain unforeseen expenses and price increases over and above the normal inflation rate, which is already incorporated in the cost estimates. To estimate the provision for contingencies, the following procedure may be followed. First, divide the project cost item into two categories. firm cost items and non-firm cost items. Second, set the provision for contingencies at 5 to 10% of the estimated cost of non-firm cost item. Alternatively, make a provision of 10% for all the items, including the margin money for working capital, if the implementation period is 1 year or less. For every additional 1 year, make an additional provision of 5%. Next is the margin money for working capital. So the principal support for working capital is provided by commercial banks and trade creditors. However, a certain part of the working capital requirement has to come from the long-term source of finance. Referred to as the margin money for working capital, this is an important element of the project cost. The margin money for working capital is sometimes utilized for meeting over the runs in capital cost. This leads to a working capital problem and sometimes a crisis when the project is commissioned. To mitigate this problem, financial institutions stipulate that a portion of the loan amount equal to the margin money for working capital be blocked initially so that it can be released when the project is completed. And the last is initial cash losses. So most of the projects incur cash losses in the initial years. Yet promoters typically do not disclose the initial cash losses because they want the project to appear attractive to the financial institution and the investing public. Failure to make a provision for such cash losses in the project cost generally affects the liquidity position and impairs the operation. Hence, prudence calls for making a provision, overt or covert, for the estimated initial cash losses. So these are some of the aspects of the financial projection. I hope that the students might get some input related with the financial projection of the project. So with this, so first we will discuss the concept of working capital. Basically, it is the amount of funds necessary to cover the cost of operating the enterprise. It is basically the sum of the current assets that is employed in the business of the company. It refers to the firm investment in short-term assets, cash, short-term securities, account receivable, and inventories. Now we will discuss the purpose of working capital. So these are the following purpose of working capital. The first purpose is a business concern needs adequate amount of working capital to facilitate the frequent payment for the purchase of raw materials, components, spares, etc. according to the needs of the business concern. The second purpose is a business concern maintains adequate amount of working capital to make the periodical payment of wages and salaries to the employees and laborers. The third purpose is a business concern maintains adequate amount of working capital in order to meet the various expenditures regarding the operations on daily basis like fuel, power, office expenses, etc. And the last purpose is a business concern maintains adequate amount of working capital in order to facilitate the credit sales of goods and to meet the short-term obligations. These are some of the purpose of working capital. Now we will discuss the advantage of working capital. The first advantage is availability of raw material regularly. So the adequacy of working capital makes it possible for a firm to pay the suppliers of raw materials on time. As a result, it will continue to receive regular supplies of raw materials and thus there will be no disruption in the production process. The second advantage is full utilization of fixed assets. Adequacy of working capital makes it possible for a firm to utilize its fixed assets fully and continuously. For example, if there is inadequate stock of raw material, the machines will not be utilized in full and their productivity will be reduced. The third advantage is cash discount. A firm having the adequate amount of working capital can avail the cash discount by purchasing the goods for cash or by making the payment before the due date. Fourth advantage is increase in credit rating. Paying its short-term obligation in time leads to a strong credit rating which enables the firm to purchase the goods on credit on favorable terms and also to maintain its line of credit with the banks it facilitates, etc. It facilitates to take the loan in case of need. Next advantage is advantage of favorable business opportunities. Whenever there are chances of increase in prices of raw material, the firm can purchase sufficient quantity if it has adequate amount of working capital. Similarly, if a firm receives a bulk order for the supply of goods, it can take advantage of such opportunity if it has sufficient working capital. Next advantage is facility in obtaining bank loans. Banks do not hesitate to advance even the unsecured loan to a firm which has sufficient working capital, because the excess of current assets over current liabilities itself is a good security. And the last advantage of adequate working capital is meeting the unseen contingencies. Adequacy of working capital enables a company to meet the unseen contingencies successfully. But these are some of the advantages of adequate working capital. Now we will discuss the disadvantage of inadequate working capital. The first disadvantage is difficulty in the availability of raw material. Inadequacy of working capital results in non-payment of creditors on time. As a result, the credit purchase of goods on favorable terms become increasingly difficult. Also, the firm cannot avail the cash discount. Second disadvantage of inadequate working capital is full utilization of fixed assets not possible. Due to frequent interruption in the supply of raw materials and paucity of stock, the firm cannot make full utilization of its machine. Third disadvantage is difficulty in the maintenance of machinery. Due to inadequacy of working capital, machines are not cared and maintained properly, which results in the closure of production on many occasions. Next disadvantage is decrease in credit rating. Because of the inadequacy of working capital, the firm is unable to pay its short-term obligation on time. It decays the firm's relation with the bankers, and it becomes difficult for the firm to borrow in case of need. Next disadvantage is non-utilization of favorable opportunities. For example, a firm cannot purchase sufficient quantity of raw material in case of sudden decrease in prices. Similarly, if a firm receives a big order, it cannot execute it due to shortage of working capital. Next disadvantage is decrease in sales. Due to shortage of working capital, the firm cannot keep sufficient stock of finished goods. It results in the decrease in sales, and also the firm will be forced to restrict its credit sales. This will further reduce the sales. The next disadvantage is difficulty in the distribution of dividend. Because of the paucity of cash resources, the firm will not be able to pay the dividend to its shareholders. And the last disadvantage is decrease in the inefficiency of management. It will become increasingly difficult for the management to pay its creditors on time and pay its day-to-day expenses. It will also be difficult to pay the wages regularly, which will have an adverse effect on the morale of managers. So these are some of the disadvantages of inadequate working capital. Now we will discuss the disadvantage of excessive working capital. So basically there are 4 disadvantages of excessive working capital. The first is excessive inventory. Excessive working capital results in unnecessary accumulation of large inventory. As a result, it increases the chances of misuse, wastage, and theft, etc. The second disadvantage is excessive debtors. Excessive working capital will result in liberal credit policy, which in turn will result in higher amount tied up in debtors and higher incidence of bad debts. The third disadvantage is adverse effect on profitability. Excessive working capital means the idle funds in the business, which adds to the cost of capital but earns no profits for the company. Hence, it has a bad effect on the profitability position of the company. And the last disadvantage is inefficiency of management. Management becomes careless due to excessive resources at their command. It results in laxity of control on expenses and cash resources. So these are some of the disadvantages of excessive working capital. Now we will discuss the operating cycle. which determines the need of working capital requirement. Basically, as profit earned depend upon the magnitude of sales, but they do not convert into the cash immediately. Why? Because there is a time gap between the credit sales and the actual realization of cash. Thus, there is a need of working capital in the form of current assets so as to deal with the problem arising from lack of immediate realization of cash against the goods sold. This is called as the operating or cash cycle. The time required to take from investment of cash in some assets and conversion of it again into the cash is called as the operating cycle. It is obvious the time gap between the sales and their actual realization of the cash is technically called as the operating cycle. Thus, the operating cycle creates the need of working capital, and its length in terms of time span required to complete the cycle is a major factor of the company's working capital requirement. Now we will discuss the working capital cycle of a manufacturing company. So from the figure we can see that the operating cycle of the company begins with the acquisition of raw material and ends with the collection of receivables. So it is divided into 4 stages. The first is the raw material storage stage. The second is the work in progress stage. The third is the finished goods stage. And the last one is the debtors collection stage. Now from the figure we can see the interrelationship of the investment in operations may be represented in operating cycle that includes acquisition of raw material and packaging material, use of raw material and packaging in the manufacturing process to create the work in progress or semi-finished goods. Then use of materials and packaging and work in progress to complete the finished goods. After that, the dispatch of finished goods from the warehouse and delivery to the customers. Then finally, recording as sales by the company on its delivery to the customer. And then use of cash resources to pay the overhead, salaries, use of cash resources to pay the trade creditors and meeting other expenses. Now we will discuss what are the factors that determine the working capital requirement. These are some of the factors. The first one is the nature of enterprise. The nature and the working capital requirements of an enterprise are interlinked. While a manufacturing industry has a long cycle of operation of working capital, the same would be sought in an enterprise involved in providing services. Therefore, the amount required also varies as per the nature. An enterprise involved in the production would require more working capital than a service sector enterprise. The second factor is size of the business units. So the general principle in this regard is that the bigger the size, the larger will be the amount of working capital. Since the larger the business units are required to maintain the large inventories for the flow of the business. The third factor is seasonal variation. The requirement of working capital fluctuates for seasonal business. The working capital needs of such business may increase considerably during the busy season and decrease during the lean season. The fourth factor is market condition. If there is high competition in the chosen product category, then one shall need to offer shops like credit, immediate delivery of goods for which the working capital requirement will be very high. Otherwise, if there is no competition or less competition in the market, then the working capital requirement will be low. The next factor is availability of raw material. If the raw material is easily and readily available, then one need not maintain a large stock of the same. Therefore, thereby reducing the working capital investment in raw material stock. On the other hand, if the raw material is not readily available, then a large working capital will be required. The next factor is growth and expansion. Growth and expansion in the volume of business results in the enhancement of working capital requirement. As business grows and expands, it needs a large amount of working capital. Normally, the need for increased working capital funds precedes growth in business activities. The next factor is price level changes. If there is increase in the general price level, then the working capital requirement increase because for maintaining the same level of current assets needs enhanced investment so that the existing level of production is continued. Next factor is credit policy relating to sales. If a firm adopts liberal credit policy in respect of sales, the amount tied up in the debtor will also be higher. Obvious, higher book debt means more working capital. On the other hand, if the firm follows tight credit policy, the magnitude of working capital will decrease. Next factor is credit policy relating to purchase. If a firm purchases more goods on credit, the requirement for working capital will be less. In other words, if liberal credit terms are available from the supplier of goods, then the requirement for working capital will also be reduced. Next factor is availability of credit from the banks. If a firm can get easy bank facility in case of need, it will operate with less working capital. On the other hand, if such facility is not available, it will have to keep large amount of working capital. Then comes the volume of profit. The net profit is the source of working capital to the extent it has been earned in cash. Higher net profit would generate more internal funds, thereby contributing the working capital pool. Next factor is level of taxes. Full amount of cash profit is not available for working capital purpose. Taxes have to be paid out of the profits. Higher the amount of taxes, less will be the profit available for the working capital. And the last factor is efficiency of the management. Efficiency of the management is also a significant factor to determine the level of working capital. Management can reduce the need of working capital by the efficient utilization of resources. It can accelerate the pace of cash cycle and thereby use the same amount of working capital again and again very quickly. But these are some of the determinants of working capital requirement. Now we will discuss the means of finance of working capital. So basically there are two sources of finance of working capital. One is the bank sources and second is the non-bank sources. So in the bank sources, following are the source of finance of working capital. The first is inventory finance. The second is bill discounting. Third is an overdraft facility. Fourth is the credit line. Fifth is the letter of credit. And sixth one is the cash credit. And if we talk about the non-bank sources, then first source is factoring. The second is commercial paper. The third is trade credit. The fourth one is advance from customers. The fifth one is accrued expenses. And the last non-bank source is miscellaneous expenses. Now, we will discuss this source of finance of working capital individually. The first bank source of finance of working capital is inventory finance. So inventory finance is a secure loan. In this case, inventory is taken as a collateral. However, inventory finance is more difficult to secure since inventory is riskier collateral than account receivable. Some inventory becomes obsolete and loses value quickly, and the other types of inventory like partially manufactured goods have little or no resale value. Therefore, the lenders need to control the inventory placed as a collateral to ensure that it is not sold before their loan is repaid. The second bank source is bill discounting. So bill discounting basically a process of handing over the endorsed or accepted bill by the company to the discounting agency like bank for ready money. It is a form of advance by which the bank advances money to the holder of the bill before its maturity date after deducting the discount. The third source is overdraft facility. So basically the overdraft facility is a formal arrangement with a bank which allows an account holder to draw on funds in excess of the amount deposited. So overdraft facility is you can say that this form of finance is mostly commonly used by the business as a way of making their working capital more flexible. Also, it can also be available to the individuals. The bank may charge an overdraft fee for accessing the overdraft facility, and the interest rate can be higher than the other types of loan. The third is the credit line. The credit line, it is an arrangement in which a bank or a vendor extends a specified amount of unsecured credit to the specified borrower for a specified period of time. There are several ways a line of credit differs from the term loan. First of all, the line of credit, in case of line of credit, the application process is very simpler and approval usually takes a days rather than a weeks. When you obtain a loan, you are given a lump sum amount of money. With a line of credit, you have the maximum amount of money available to you, but you use only what you need. In case of line of credit, the interest rate is chargeable on the amount borrowed on line of credit, but in case of loan, the interest rate is chargeable on the whole amount. The next bank source is letter of credit. A letter of credit is an arrangement whereby a bank helps its customer to obtain the credit from its suppliers. When a bank opens a letter of credit in favor of its customers from some specific purchases, the bank undertakes the responsibility to honor the obligation of its customers should the customer fail to do so. And the last bank source is cash credit. A cash credit is an arrangement under which the borrower is allowed to withdraw money from the bank up to a certain limit on hypothecation or place of certain security such as stock. Maximum amount of credit limit is determined on the basis of financial position and credit worthiness of the borrower. So these are some of the bank source of finance of working capital. Now we will discuss the non-bank source of finance of working capital. The first non-bank source is factoring. So factoring, it entails the sales of account receivable to another firm, which is called as the factor, who then collects the payment from the customer. Through factoring, a business can shift the cost of collection and the risk of non-payment to a third party. In a factory arrangement, a company and a factor work out a credit limit and average collection period for each customer. As the company makes new sales to a customer, it provides an invoice to the factor, against which the factors makes the advance payment immediately, near about 80% of the value of account receivable to the company. The customer pays the factor directly and the factor then pays the company based on agreed upon average collection period, less slight discount that covers the factor's collection cost and the credit risk. The next non-bank source is commercial paper. It is a popular instrument for financing working capital requirements, accounts receivable, inventories, and meeting short-term liabilities of the company. It is basically a short-term promissory note, negotiable and transferable, and has a fixed maturity period. This instrument was basically introduced in the year 1989 to enable the corporate borrowers to raise short-term funds. It can be issued for a period ranging from 15 days to 1 year. The commercial paper is an unsecured instrument, is not usually backed by any kind of collateral, issued in the form of promissory note. Next non-bank source is trade credit. For many business, the trade credit is an essential tool for financing growth. Trade credit is the credit extended to you by the suppliers who let you buy now and pay later. Anytime you take the delivery of materials, equipments, or other valuables without paying cash on the spot, it means you are using the trade credit. Next comes the advance from the customers. Manufacturers whose products are in great demand usually demand advance money from the customers and agents at the time of accepting their order. Such an advance is a fixed percentage of the value of the order. Such advance are the part of the price of the goods and no interest is paid on them. Then comes the accrued expenses. These are the expenses which have been incurred but have not become due for payment. The most common items of accruals are wages, salaries, interest, and taxes. Wages and salaries are usually paid in the month next to the month in which the service are rendered. And the last non-bank source is miscellaneous expense. Some concern resort to miscellaneous source of finance in times of pressing needs, such as loan from the directors, intercorporate deposits, etc. So these are some of the sources of financing the working capital requirement. So I hope that the student may get some orientation about the means of finance of working capital requirement. So with this, I'm going to end the video lecture. Thank you.